This is Jim Semivan, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and I am joined on the podcast today by an author, researcher, and experiencer. His name is Steve Aspin, and he's here to discuss his brilliant book, Out of Time, the Intergenerational Abduction Program Explored. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Andy. Good to be here.
Very good. Yeah, very good to finally have you on. We've had to reschedule once or twice, but here we are. And Steve, I always like to start off the podcast speaking to the guests with just a little bit about yourself and your own background.
Sure.
And I commonly ask how the UFO topic first became a part of your life. Was it a TV show? Was it a book you read? But for you, the phenomenon has really played a part in not only your own life, but your family's too, hasn't it?
Yeah, but it has, but I didn't realise, none of us realised, I didn't realise until my 50s that it was to do with unidentified flying objects or aliens at all. I thought as a child, as did my, my mother and grandmother, I cloaked it in its folklore, it's something weird and... it's one of those things that's part of human life, and it's part of the ancestral stuff, and it's one of those strange things. And my mother was very attracted to spiritualism, and she cloaked it in the afterlife and spirits talking to her and that kind of thing. And she was a medium. She wasn't a medium. She used to go and visit mediums, but she became a quite successful spiritual healer in her final years with us, which she died in 2000, 23 years ago. And my grandmother, I only had one conversation about the phenomenon with her, and she cloaked it absolutely in the fairies and the pixies paradigm, because growing up in a Yorkshire farm, as a Yorkshire farmer's daughter, and later in an urban area of West Yorkshire in the early 20th century, she had nothing else to explain it, and that's the framework she put in it. So until I was 51, I didn't really connect it with alien abduction at all, or the extraterrestrial paradigm. I had no idea about that. So that's a brief history.
Going to say those labels of pixies, fairies, and it's funny because people in a modern setting can sometimes laugh those off as, pixies and fairies and such don't exist. But like you say, if you go back 50, 60, 70 years and even further back than that, these are just labels for things that weren't understood at the time, or people had no, frame of reference for. If you go back to Roman times, there's talk of flying shields or burning shields in the sky because they didn't know about flying saucers or even aircraft at the time. So you talk about it how you know it. So I think that's important to reference, that when we hear about angels and demons even, these are just ways of describing entities that are just unknown.
There are a number of extraordinary things in the natural world, and all these paradigms, all these things that interest people, and things that they connect themselves to are, possibly have some reality to them. I mean, the alien abduction thing is what my book is about, because it's the core of it. Explains everything that's happened to my family throughout the generations, and even obviously many of your audience will understand about Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia thesis, which he published in 1979, which attached the whole flying saucer extraterrestrial paradigm to the folklore and fairies, throughout history, and that's actually served to muddy the waters about the abduction subject somewhat. Unfortunately, it wasn't his intention to do that, but it's actually what a lot of people in the field attach themselves to, or give a great deal of credence to, and I think possibly more credence than it actually deserves.
In what way? What do you think? Are people picking up these ideas and applying them rather than experiencing those for themselves and describing them?
Well, it's the Magonia thesis is quite common in the UFO field. If you go to conferences and mix with people, or go on chat forums and so forth, it comes up again and again. This idea that John Cahill had of Operation Trojan Horse, and the crypto-terrestrial idea that there's beings inside the planet that's largely responsible for the flying saucer phenomenon. And I think, personally, I think it's 100% of it is extraterrestrial in origin, but it because they're so rooted in popular culture in so many ways, it's often interpreted that way.
And you mentioned that the phenomenon itself wasn't something that occurred to you until you were in your 50s. And
That's
I'm right in saying you wrote most of the book last year in 2022. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. I had chapter 1 in draft for more than 10 years. And I had sketched out a couple of things that I wanted to cover should I ever commit to writing the manuscript and publishing. And the brief story is, in 2007, I finally realized that the abduction phenomenon had been happening to me all my life. If your viewers read the book, they will wonder why, when they read through chapter 1, which is about 25 pages, why it didn't occur to me any earlier, which is, shocking, really. It didn't. Because it just literally never occurred to me, even though I'd read Whitley Strieber's Communion in 1987, and I knew about the alien abduction as a subject, which I'd come across because I was kind of fascinated by the UFO subject from even as a child, and I really didn't put it together. But in 2007, I actually put it together, and that set me off on an investigative journey. First of all, I read Budd Hopkins' books, where I always knew about him or had heard of him, but I had no interest in pursuing his works. But I finally read them in 2007. I read the books of Dr. David Jacobs. I read a few more books like the John Mack's books from Harvard University, and Ray Fowler, and a number of these people, particularly in the United States, the authors there. And I'd seen Nick Pope on TV because he's a great media presence. And at the time, he was working for the UK Ministry of Defence, and I'd seen him on late night television quite a bit, and on documentaries on the Discovery Channel and so forth. So I contacted Nick. I found his email address on the internet, and I wrote to him. And I didn't expect a reply, but he replied within a few hours, and he met up with me. And he gave me a great deal of guidance during the first year or so of my engagement with the subject. And I set off on a quest to try and meet fundamentally with Budd Hopkins, whose books impressed me the most. And he seemed to be really, really deeply into this. And what he wrote about was precisely and exactly what reflecting in my own life. And I thought, if this guy has come to understand this so well, I want to meet this guy. And chapter 6 is the story of my efforts to meet Budd Hopkins, which lasted over a year, including several visits to the United States, before I actually met him right at the end of 2008, when he contacted me by telephone out of the blue, because my wife had found a scoop mark scar on my right shoulder. And she said, I've seen these in books on UFOs and stuff, and books on abductions. I actually have no acquaintance with the body scarring at all, really, and not in detail. And she sent the photos off to a few researchers who she knew in the United States. She'd gotten to know. And via Peter Robbins and a rather circuitous route, they found their way to Budd Hopkins. Just so happened that Breakthrough Films were working with Budd Hopkins, making a film about his work. And they wanted some fresh scoop mark scars, that cases that had never been in the public domain before, never been investigated. So Budd phoned me up at the end of September 2008 and asked if I'd go to Manhattan. And he offered me to stay in his apartment. And he said we'd be there for a week, and I'd be interviewed by the producer and owner of Breakthrough Films, and we'd go to a Manhattan leading dermatological laboratory, and my skull would be biopsied, and a pathology report would be issued, and we would do the whole thing. So in 2008, and in early December, we actually finally went there, and I finally met Bo face to face. But that was the end of a very long process, and this visit was serendipitous in that it wasn't really initiated by me eventually, because he's very hard to reach. But I mean, he was. You probably know that he died in 2011, but he was quite seriously ill for quite a long time before that, with 2 different types of cancer, and underwent remission, and then he got worse and so forth. So during 2008, he'd been booked to appear at a couple of conferences, which I'd gone to in the hope of meeting him, and both times he didn't show because of illness. He had to cancel. So this meeting at the end of 2008 was unexpected and very fortuitous, and it led to a whole host of doors opening to me, and it led to me understanding the phenomenon far more deeply and in all its complexity in a way that I'd never come to before, and would not have come to had I not linked up with him, and also David Jacobs, who was Budd's close friend and lived and worked in Philadelphia, and was at the time a professor of history at Temple University. He's now retired. But all these doors opened because of this fortuitous meeting in 2008. So that started me on a journey of investigation into this phenomenon, which I record in the later chapters of the book, and introduced me to a whole load of people whose narratives and ideas I weave into the later chapters of the book. So that's a potted history of the whole thing.
No, it's fascinating, and we're kind of starting going backwards, but it feels like that's been the process for you, that it's taken till those later stages of you doing the work to realise what had happened back in the past, because as you've described, you had experiences that you would now put down to being part of this program or phenomenon as a child, didn't you?
Yeah. No, a lot of people, kids don't realise that if they, as an example, a minority of children have persistent, really aggressive nosebleeds. When I was 7, 8, 9 years old, in those years, I had violent nosebleeds at school. In class, the blood would come running out of one nostril or the other nostril, or dripping on the desk. And I became quite notorious for them. And the school called my parents in and suggested very strong terms that they'd take me to a physician and get me to a specialist and see what was causing this, because it was quite disruptive in the class. My mother said to me at the time, she said, "Oh, I had most nosebleeds as a kid, just like you." And they just, in the end, it just stopped. It's just one of those things, you know. Obviously, I know now why she had nosebleeds, because some of your audience will know that abductees have implants put in certain parts of their body, and one of the prime sites they use is the cribriform plate next to where the olfactory nerve goes into the brain. It's right at the top of the nasal pharynx, and when these implants get slightly dislodged because you might have a sneezing fit or a cold, or over time they haven't been put in quite right. That they result in nosebleeds, quite bad nosebleeds. That was almost certainly the cause of it. So none of us knew anything about this at the time. It was just that Steve, as a kid who has nosebleeds, and it's a really real nuisance, and we can't stop it. They took me to the GP, and I think we went to a specialist, but he couldn't recommend anything particularly to stop it. So obviously the medical specialists they took me to weren't particularly, acquainted with the abduction phenomenon, because almost nobody is. So they could suggest nothing, and no X-rays were taken because nothing which might show up on X-ray was suspected. So it wasn't done. And there were other things like night terrors and so forth, which I had as a child as well, and a number of things which only when I was 16 years old did I have a real memorable alien abduction experience. And even then I didn't put it down as alien abduction, because in 1972 in the UK it really wasn't a thing. I think the Hill case was known about by a tiny minority of the population who'd
Sure.
read about these things in UFO magazines, and maybe the Antonio Villas-Boas case was known about, but it was so fantastical and so improbable that nobody really took it that seriously. And it was only in 1972. So when this thing happened to me in 1972, which I describe in the book in some detail, I didn't have anything to attach it to. I just didn't understand it at all.
The incident in 1972 happened in the summer, like you mentioned, you were 16, and it involved some of the classic hallmarks of an abduction experience, including the period of missing time. I believe it was around 2 hours, 2 hours, 2
hours and 20 minutes. 2 hours and 20 minutes. It was
talk us through some of the basics.
I had a compulsion about 2 or 3 days prior to this. The background is when I was 16 years old, I had my first job, and I just worked the summer holidays in a big nursery in Cheshire who grew thousands and thousands of rose trees. And I worked there from Sunday through to Friday, 5 days a week in the week, and double time on Sunday. So, it was worth doing. Saturday was the only day I didn't go to work, so I slept in and did other things on Saturday. A couple of days prior to that, on the Thursday night, the 20th of July, 1972, I had this really strong compulsion, which makes no sense now and made no sense then. A really strong compulsion to get up on Saturday morning because I was supposed to go somewhere. And if I explain that at the time, and I explain it to many people now, it doesn't make any sense to them. But on Saturday morning, I woke up at 5 o'clock, and the sun was above the horizon at that time of the morning in the summer. And I got my clothes on and went out, and I walked about a mile from the house. We lived in a suburban neighbourhood in Cheshire, on the Wirral. And I walked about a mile to where some new houses were being built on the Greenfield site. And I thought, as I got there, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. What now? And suddenly it was 2 hours and 20 minutes later. And I was surrounded by blue and indigo lights in that part of the spectrum, filling the air and pulsating, and this whooshing in my ears. And I found myself looking at my wristwatch, which is the strap had come loose. I don't know how. And noticing that 2 hours and 20 minutes gone by. It was now 8:05. When I arrived at this place, what seemed like 2 seconds earlier, it was 5:45. And suddenly it was 8:05. And all these things were happening. I heard a voice in my head not in my ears, but in my head, that I was going to forget everything that happened this morning, and I wouldn't remember. So don't even try. You're not going to remember anything anyway. It was a very sort of bored-sounding, monotonous, completely uninspired a voice in my head that said, "You're not going to remember any of this, so don't even think about it." And I was inside one of these part-built houses, which was like 3/4 built. So it had walls and timbers between the floors and the roof, but there was no window panes. There was no window frames or panes. There were just rectangular holes in the brickwork where the windows were to be fitted. And I was standing in front of one of these apertures where the window was to be fitted, and I looked. Right in front of me, about 100 meters away and about 30 meters off the ground, was a flying saucer. Clear as day. I've associated it with these whooshing sounds and these blue and indigo flashing lights all around me. And this thing drifted from left to right of my vision, and it disappeared, right behind the brickwork. And suddenly, everything was back to normal. And I just thought, what the hell was that? What was I doing here? And I decided I'd just walk home. What else was there to do? And because it was already after 8 o'clock. And I thought, where's that time gone? Where was I? Was I in some sort of coma? Did I pass out, or did I just forget everything that happened? What was that? And I felt my left cheek was wet, damp, and kind of felt uncomfortable. And when I got home, I looked in the bathroom mirror, and there was a round circular mark the size of a coin, a large coin on the left cheek, which was raw and red, like the skin had been burned. And it took about a day or two to scab over, and then it took 3 months to completely disappear. Now, it healed pretty much in alignment, in accordance with how you'd expect an injury to heal. I had no idea where it had come from. I thought it was associated with this weird thing that happened on Saturday morning, and you tend to be quite attentive to your appearance when you're 16 years old. You tend to be quite self-conscious about it, yeah? But somehow I managed not to notice it, to ignore it, and not pay any attention to it, and nobody seemed to ask about it. And it was rough for 3 months, and eventually the skin flaked off, and it disappeared. The whole experience was so incomprehensible, and I had nothing to explain it or attach it to. So I just buried it in the back of my mind and thought, one day maybe I'll understand that weird thing that happened on Saturday morning, July the 22nd. But I've got other things to get on with now. And so I got on with other things, rock music and playing the guitar and planning to go to university and all the rest of it. So it's kind of pushed it into the background. It did emerge from time to time when I gave it some thought, and particularly on the subject of strange things that happen to people, come into the conversation when you're with a group of mates in the pub or something. I thought about that, and I could never really explain it even to myself with anything that made any kind of sense. So it was only in 2007 that it all became obvious what it was. Prior to that, no.
First off, thanks for sharing, because any kind of experience like that's very intimate, and that takes a lot for anyone to discuss. So thank you. I just want to ask, so you've grown up with this experience being there, and you've buried it yourself in your kind of the back of your mind, your subconscious almost. Did you ever share it with anyone as you grew up, even if it was those moments with a mate in the pub and you've had a few too many, or with a girlfriend or a wife? Was there ever a moment the story came out or almost came out?
I may have told certain parts of it. a weird thing happened to me in 1972, one summer's morning, but I can't make any sense of it. But I think I have a vague memory, not very clear, but I have a vague memory of seeing a flying saucer. And once I said that, a lot of people would just go, disbelief would come out, and certainly among some of the audience. So I really stopped mentioning it, stopped talking about it, because I had nothing to attach it to. Could make no sense of it. I think maybe if I were growing up in the United States, maybe in the 1970s or 1980s, it would have been a little bit more in the public discourse. Not a lot, but a little bit more in the public discourse. But in provincial England, in northwest England in 1972, it made no sense.
I can understand that, and you're right that geography and location and time plays a factor into these conversations, and even people's own religious upbringing can be a factor in these kind of discussions.
Absolutely, yeah, very important that a lot of people attach their abduction experiences to religion, to religious experiences. Yeah, they do.
I've heard you mention, and I always like to shout out where possible, on Howard Hughes' Unexplained, which I'm a fan of, and I've listened to Howard for many years.
Yeah.
You mentioned that missing time isn't actually missing time, and that during the abduction, and I'm just reading this now, so I've got it correct, the memory is removed from the short-term memory and placed into long-term memory. Is that correct? That's what you said.
Yeah, nobody really understood this really until Dr. David Jacobs did a lot of work on this, and a couple of other people have too, but particularly he listened to abductees very attentively for many years, and he tried to, because the missing time phenomenon was quite well known, that people are walking along a country road and suddenly it's an hour later, or suddenly 2 hours later, and they're 200 meters on from where they were a second before, or a couple is driving in a car and they see a bright light in the sky which gets bigger and bigger, and they stop. What they usually say is, we stopped to take a better look at it. And sometimes they open the doors or the windows and get out of the car, sometimes they don't, but suddenly it's 2 hours later, and the light in the sky is either gone or is receding, and they wonder what's happened to the time. Now, what's happened to the time is you have lived through the time normally, but you have no memory of it. That's the title of Budd Hopkins' first book was Missing Time. This book in 1982, and it's been universally recognised as associated with the phenomenon as missing time. What they're doing is they have these mind scan procedures where they can stare into your eyes, or one of your eyes, from a couple of centimetres away, and they lock into the optic nerve and they do something to your neurological framework. They do something to your brain where the experience that you've had is somehow put into long-term memory, taken out of the short-term memory, so that when you get back home, or when they've left, all you remember is it was 8:30, and then suddenly it was 10:30, just like that. And the clock in the car said suddenly it's suddenly 10:30, and we both felt something really weird had happened to us. Something very strange had happened, and we felt very uncomfortable. We've no idea when the time went. Where the time went is that you lived it normally, but the memory of it has been put into long-term memory, where it remains until you develop a technique to access it and dig into your long-term memory. When you can retrieve it. I give quite a lot of time to this in the later chapters of the book, how this works, how memory recovery works, and it's sometimes called hypnosis, but it's not completely accurate to call it hypnosis, but because you're retrieving memories from the long-term memory that have been deliberately buried there.
let me ask, Steve, why do you think that the memory is left there at all? It would either, to me, surely make sense to leave it in the short term, in which case that's up to the experiencer to go ahead and discuss, but why not remove it completely?
That's something I can't answer. I can tell you what the abductors seem to have said to a couple of abductees that I've interviewed. They say, we leave it in the long-term memory because in the future you're going to need those memories of these things that happen to you, and we'll liberate them from you when the time is right, or something like that.
You've mentioned Budd Hopkins' books and how important it was meeting Budd and others face to face, and I wonder, in meeting individuals like Budd Hopkins, like Peter Robbins, discussing these with Nick Pope, what did you learn about your own experiences and your own abduction experience that you maybe didn't know before?
Well, I learned to recognise that what had been happening to me throughout my life was actually pretty normal for abductees, and they weren't unique to me. They happen to, I go into, in chapter 8, I go into how many abductees there might be in the human population and why that number, and how the intergenerational aspects of the phenomenon works. And I think there's between 150 million and 400 million people in the local population who are involved in this. And I think at least 95% of them, maybe 98% of them, have no idea what's happening to them. They just feel they lead weird lives. They lead strange lives. They keep quiet about it. They lead a secret life. They can never understand why their lives are so strange, but they just carry on. But I think there's that many people, between 2 and 5% of the global population are abductees. And I think that percentage is a significant key to what these abductors are doing and why, and how they're conducting this program.
Without going into all that detail, because again, the listeners will want to go out and buy the book and read this for themselves, but just to touch on that, what sort of conclusions are you coming to, that if there's a program that is deliberately set up by one or more entities, which are technologically far superior and more advanced than us, to manipulate us as a species, why has this happened in the first place, and to what end?
Honestly, I wish I could answer that. It seems like they want some kind of long-term presence here, and they are preparing the ground extremely thoroughly. If they're you see, I write about in the final chapter about the universe. It's 13.7 to 14 billion years old. All our astrophysicists and cosmologists tell us, and there's confluence of several proofs that this is the case. Planet Earth and the solar system, our sun and our system, is only 1/3 the age of the known universe. So it's about 4.5 billion years old. The Earth is 4.5 billion. In the center of our galaxy, there are billions, or maybe 200 billion star systems that are 3 times older than ours. So what any life forms who've evolved and developed on those hundreds of billions of star systems, what some of them, the technologies some of them may have mastered and developed, are pretty much beyond what we can imagine. And I think there's evidence that some of them have been, the abducting entities that I'm writing about have been coming here certainly since, I think the program started in about 1890, or between 1890 and 1900, and I bring quite a lot of evidence to the table in the book that there's to support that. It's very specific specifically began then, and why I think that's the case. Why we may have had plenty of alien intelligences interacting with us in different ways prior to that, but I think this particular program starts in between 1890 and 1900, and that they plan what they're doing what they do. They took some origin abductees in the early part of the program, and they have developed the grey aliens, which are not actually the aliens themselves. The grey aliens are actually workers, genetically designed and bred to carry out the program, to do the grunt work, and the program is designed to work over several generations, 3 to 4 generations. Who knows what they're doing or what they have been doing to the abductee lines? I don't really know what they've been doing to them, but there's a reason why, which is we can only speculate about. There are reasons why they take the children of abductees and their children, or not necessarily all the children, but some of them tend to be abducted, and their children. So for every one on Earth now who's an abductee, who's having abduction experiences, you can pretty much guarantee that one of their parents, or both, and one of their grandparents, or more, and one of their great-grandparents was in the program, and they are following this genetic line, and that's how it's done.
Was there a time in your life? Yeah, no. Please finish off. Yeah.
To what end, we can only speculate about, and there's endless speculation about this. I really tread very carefully when dealing with areas of speculation. I like that.
No, that's fair enough.
It's obvious. There's obviously some reason to them why they do it in that way.
Was there a time in your life you feel these events had slowed or finally stopped completely for you?
Good question. I've had fewer incidents the last couple of years, but I've had some moderately serious health issues in my 60s. Nothing that's finished me off, but things that rather hadn't happened. But many abductees in their 60s and 70s say that the interval between events spaces out. There's a guy called Bob Jacobs, who's ex-USAF guy. Do you know who he is? He was involved. Yeah, he was involved in the Malmström incidents in the 1960s, where he was part of the film crew that filmed an intercontinental ballistic missile test over the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles away, with the very high intensity cameras, which was attacked and monitored by a classic flying saucer. One of the kind of dome shape with the classic saucer shape, and it was caught on film, and the Air Force confiscated the film, and there's a whole story behind that. But Bob's now just over 80, and he's still having. I'm not giving away any confidential information now, because Bob co-wrote a book with Robert Hastings, who's a close friend of mine, called Confession, which was published in 2019. Bob writes the second half of the book, and Robert Hastings wrote the first half of the book. Bob Jacobs says in his 80s he's still having incidents, and he's still having nighttime in abductions that scar his body and so forth, and produce marks on his skin. So he's in his 80s, and it's still going on with him. With me, it doesn't seem to be as prevalent or as frequent as it used to be. I will say that. But I had an event, 2 notable events last year, and one very significant event the year before. Maybe there may have been more abductions that are not remembered, but one of these events last year resulted in me coughing out what I think was an implant in the top part of the nose, and it bled for 24 hours when that implant was out. And after several weeks, I've got the dates in the book. What the expulsion of the implant was in February 2022, and the replacement was in April 2022 when they obviously discovered that it wasn't transmitting anymore, and they put it back. And also when they put it back, I had a nosebleed for 24 hours. So that's still going on. And the year before, I had a nighttime event which resulted in the classic equilateral triangle of puncture marks on my left arm, which I woke up in the middle of the night and I could feel the wetness on the left arm, and I went in the kitchen to see what had happened, and I had these 3 equilateral puncture marks on my left arm. So they're still going on, and I'm in my 60s now, but they don't seem to be as frequent as they were when I was younger. No.
We talk about these beings and visitations being far more advanced than we are, yet some of the medical procedures seem still quite barbaric or rough, don't they? But if you watch Star Trek, the original series, or the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, all the medical procedures are painless and small injection guns in your neck, a little puff of air, and that's you're cured. Yet it still sounds quite brutal what these beings tend to do in terms of procedures.
Yeah, they do. It does. You see, I don't really speculate about how a future an extremely advanced race might deal with medicine, or what they're actually doing to their human abductees. But you just have to say the evidence is that they do what they do, and maybe that's the only way they can do it, or that's the most painless and non-intrusive way they've found. But that's what they do. When they take little chunks of your tissue, the scoop marks. I mean, you've seen the scoop marks, Andy, in the
appendix, yes.
Yeah, but you've probably seen them in the UFO literature. They're quite ubiquitous. So that's what they do. You'd think, a Star Trek-like civilization wouldn't have to do that. They might have a more subtle way of sampling you, but that's what they do. So you just have to say the evidence is that they do these things because we have the evidence in front of us.
What I would love to ask you then, Steve, I appreciate, you don't want to speculate, because without knowing it would just be that pure speculation. But to look at the evidence that's there, it would have to indicate that, and many people like to talk about these other beings as being very much love and light, or very peaceful, very harmonious. But for me, it reminds me of how the human species treats other species we see as lesser or inferior to us, even if it comes to animal testing, that, we're going to do our best to be what we would call humane, but it's still going to leave a mark. It's still going to be traumatic, and we have to do it for some other greater good. Is that something you've thought about yourself?
Yes. I mean, there may be beings who are full of light and benevolence, who are visitors and who interact with us. But the abducting entities are here in very large numbers, and there's a big program, and it's structured over a century or more, and it's obviously invested an enormous amount of resources into this. And I write in the book that, is there any evidence that the human race is not the first time they've done this? I mean, there is evidence that this is not the first time they've done this. We won't go into all that now, but there is evidence. So there may well be, and I'm really confident there are other alien civilizations which occasionally, perhaps frequently, visit us, but they're not in the numbers that of these entities that prosecuting the abduction program. This is an enormous enterprise, and there's an enormous amount of resources invested in it.
In your time researching your own experiences and speaking to others, I wonder, have you ever come across cases where people have been abducted but ultimately not returned?
I haven't, but I understand some such cases do exist. Do you know that there's a policeman in Lancashire? I can't remember what's his name. The Todmorden incident. What was the guy's name? He's a police officer about 20 years ago. You may not know it, but Gary Heseltine knows this guy.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Okay.
But he investigated a case as a police officer where somebody was killed and dumped on top of a large rubbish dump, and it was all it's all involved. The police concluded it was some sort of occult ceremony or something, but it have been strongly linked to the abduction phenomenon. But I don't know of any personally, but I believe there are cases in the literature that rare cases, but they happen anyway. They happen nonetheless, yes.
I've just been watching recently the David Paulides Missing 411, the UFO connection.
Yeah.
And obviously that whole series looks at missing persons, but particularly with a focus on the UFO subject, obviously, for the last one, and some very interesting cases within that. I'd love to ask, and this was one actually I wrote just before you came on, Steve, the title of the book, Out of Time, is that written to be taken multiple different ways? Because I read it from the first time I saw the title Out of Time, that these beings come from out with our timeline or out with time itself. But then when you read the book, not to spoil things, it can be taken as we have run out of time. And I just wonder, was that deliberate?
Yes, it's deliberate. It's a title with more than one meaning, with more than one nuanced meaning. The only other title I seriously considered for the book when I was writing the manuscript was The Unbelieved, which would focus on the attitude to abductees who have these experiences. Yeah. The out of time won out in the end. Yeah.
I like it. And like I say, just purely from my own point of view, I'd always read it one way. And just before you came on, I thought, actually, thinking back, is that, yeah, so I like it. What I want to do is, there are lots of aspects that I've not touched on yet because I got some fantastic listener questions in. Some of them might be related to ideas in the book. Some of them are just more putting them out there for your consideration. But I'll get through some of these before we finish up. So a couple of questions from regular contributor Dave Smethurst. Thanks again, Dave, for sending in the list that you did. I'll ask a few of these. Are there any common factors in abductions that suggest people are taken to any underground facilities or bases, supporting the idea potentially that ultra-terrestrials would be responsible?
Hi, Dave. I know of some abductees, including one who doesn't live far from you. I won't identify him. Who's a senior police officer who claims that this has happened to him, and he is really quite compelling evidence that it probably did. And he's quite a good artist, and he's drawn some of these scenarios that he's been involved in. None of this is in my book, by the way, but I have this stuff on file. I think it's comparatively unusual for abductees to be taken to underground facilities or, something. I don't know whether, if these things actually happen, if there are non-flying saucer environments that abductees are taken to, which a minority of abductees say they are. I don't know whether that's whether these are created by the abducting entities, which are extraterrestrial. They would just have bases under the ocean or whatever, or whether there are other beings involved. I really just don't know about that. It's comparatively unusual. I've interviewed 40 or 50 abductees without giving them names or pseudonyms in the book. I just weave their narratives into the text. Only this one abductee that I mentioned has ever discussed such a scenario with me. But he claims that not only was he taken to a mine, like a mine shaft, but he met two other abductees there that he's read about and identified through the literature, because these two abductees wrote a book called Connections, co-authors, and he reckoned he met them years before they wrote the book, and he identified them very precisely as to who they are and what they look like. So yes, these things do seem to happen to some people, yes.
I wonder in your own research if you've come across, and you may know from your own experience that might be more difficult, is there a feeling that you do leave the planet when you're taken? Because we hear different abductees talk about being taken into deep outer space. Some of them say they literally remained in a craft above the field they were taken in. Others, they don't know. And I just wonder, is there a pattern to that, or any inkling you've had, Steve?
Good question. I don't know, because I've never been able to look out of a window, and they never tell me where we are, in relation to the rest of the universe. We're just in this enclosed space, and they're focusing on my physiology or my brain. That's it. And then we're taken back. So I honestly don't know about that. I mean, I know some abductees claim to have been taken around the moon and claim to fly above, very, very high in the atmosphere. I myself have no recollection of those kind of details, but some abductees have very clear recollection of them.
I know there's a party of researchers and investigators who, while out with Chris Bledsoe, report that they were taken to basically a station on the moon and come back, but they don't really talk about it. So very interesting. Dave also asks, have you noticed any direct connections to cattle mutilations and the human abduction program?
There's an incident in Out of Time, in chapter 1, which I described when I was 14 in rural southwest Ireland. I was taken to see a cattle mutilation on a farm I was staying at, and as with the abduction in 1972, I could make no sense of this. This cow, I was taken there at 9 o'clock in the morning just after breakfast, and a fully adult cow, which was valued by the farm as a very good milker, because they were rural Irish farmers, they weren't particularly well off, was lying on its back with its legs sticking up in the air like this at a kind of angle, rigid. All four of its legs were rigid, and part of its jawbone had been removed, and one of his ears had been cut off, and one of his eyes had been gouged out. So it was a big red hole. It was like cauterized, and its back end, its whole anal rectal area, and its birth canal were kind of cut out as like a cylinder, with very, very, very thorough surgery. There was no blood on the ground anywhere, and the vet had been called, and the vet had proclaimed this cow had died of anthrax. I would imagine that the vet had to give some kind of diagnosis. He had absolutely no idea what he was looking at, and so he told the farmer, it's anthrax. This cow's died of anthrax. Now, you may know that anthrax is not a contagious disease, but the spores are extremely fastidious, and if anthrax is suspected or diagnosed in any animal, human, the region, let alone the locality, is usually evacuated. It's extremely rare and it's extremely serious. So that wasn't done. And I think the vet probably just told the farmer this because he assumed the farmer would have no acquaintance with anthrax, didn't really know what its symptoms were, but knew it was extremely rare, and he had to give some explanation as to how this cow had died, because that was his professional job, to explain how this cow had died. So what was the question about cattle mutilations and abductions?
Yeah, do you see any direct communications between those?
Well, in my case, I was the abductee, or one of the abductees in the family, and I was taken to see this cattle mutilation, and it was only in the 1990s that I recognised, when I watched a Linda Howe's documentary, Strange Harvest. I looked at these cows in Colorado and in Utah and in Montana and so forth, and said, those animals are exactly what I saw in Ireland in 1970. They were mutilated exactly the same as that. And that's when I began to wonder whether I was I'd seen a very rare, not maybe the first mutilation in Ireland or in the British Isles at that time. I'm not sure how it fits in with what the abductors are doing. If it is them, those entities are responsible for the cattle mutilations. Somebody is responsible for them, and it's associated with unidentified flying objects and with activity of UFOs, and it's not been explained away effectively as anything else. I mean, as you probably know, a lot of these cows are found drop from high up, and they land in trees with their legs sticking up in the air, and these kind of things. So obviously, it's not the idea of predators or coyotes or something like that is ridiculous. I mean, also Ireland doesn't have any natural predators that kill and eat cattle. So how it links with the abduction subjects, I actually don't know how it works. But it's
one.
Yes.
I was going to say just one more from Dave, because he's got a few different topics here to discuss, and Dave did send about 15 questions, so I'm just going with the 3 from him.
Good, Dave.
Do you, Steve, put any credence in the human hybrid breeding program? We hear these stories often about human women being taken to meet their hybrid children. Dave personally feels it's very out there and maybe a bit much, but have you come across this?
Yes, it is very out there. Yes, I have come across it. Yes, I have met female abductees that have been through this process. It's a thing. It actually is a real thing. And furthermore, it's a core part of the program. I don't go into this that much in the book because I'll step back a couple of pages. My book is an attempt to introduce the alien abduction phenomenon as a real thing with hard scientific medical evidence, particularly with the bodily scarring and the implants and so forth, to a skeptical or not particularly interested audience that's just a little bit curious about it. Maybe they've come across it on TV documentaries or on the internet, and they just some acquaintance with it, but they think it's all strange and something that's might be real, might not be, but it's all a bit strange. But I don't go into the hybrid breeding program in my book because I think that would be a bit of a stretch for the intended audience of the book. But I do have an entire chapter on it, but at a very introductory level. And I write what abductees report multiple abductees from multiple places and multiple times. And there's a consistency of the reports that are very compelling. And that does seem to be a very central feature of the abduction program, that they plan to have a permanent presence here, and the way their presence will be manifest will be from beings that look and sound exactly like us. They're 99.9% human, but there's a little bit in there that is from the aliens. And I don't really make a big thing out of this, but I do introduce it as a definite theme in the later chapters. That's one of the motivations of the program.
A couple of questions from Ryan Terry. So thanks, Ryan. Have you found any commonality between abductees' traits that could shed light on what the overall plan is, be it, a blood type or a disorder of some kind, genetically maybe?
Yeah. Personally, no. There's been a lot of speculation about this. The reason I haven't found it is probably because I haven't looked for it and haven't examined a lot of claims and ideas about this. I don't find much. One of the things that was mentioned a few years ago was, all abductees seem to have a rhesus negative blood type. Is that you've come across that?
That's come up, yeah, because my mum has that blood type, yeah.
Yeah, I'm rhesus positive, and I've been a lifetime abductee, so it's not a universal thing. And if it does happen, and I'm not sure why that would necessarily mark you out as different, but it doesn't really seem to have a lot of substance in it. There may be other things.
Yeah, there may be something that no one's even thought of yet, or completely nothing to us, but could to them.
What I do is in chapter 3, which is titled The Program, I have a list of 35 different things that abductees report happens to them or report about their lives, some of which are physiological and some of which are psychological and some of which are just weird things that happen around me, like bright lights flying around the home, and able to occasionally understand what other people are thinking, which is associated with recent abduction activity and so forth. But whether abductees have very definitely detectable medical markers of that kind, I'm not sure I would necessarily go that far. I really don't know.
No, thanks. Ryan also asks, can abductees sense implants in each other? So either yourself, have you ever come across someone and you've thought you can tell, or vice versa maybe?
I can't. Do you know Debbie Jordan Cowbell? You know who she is?
Mm-hmm, yep.
Yeah. Have you ever interviewed her, by the way? No?
No.
She claims she can sense things in other abductees. She says she can see it in their eyes. And the abductee population is about 1 in 25 of the human race. But as far as I'm concerned, no.
Let me ask on that, Stephen. I've left this off till now. I was going to ask in the body of the interview if it was relevant, but I want to ask now. Coming from I'll put my devil's advocate hat on, my skeptical hat on for a moment. And this would come up in general conversation. I'm sure if you had this conversation with a member of the general public with no interest in the UFO subject, if you claim to have an implant of any kind, what's stopping you now going to a doctor surgery, privately or otherwise, and saying that I want this taken out, removed and studied? Yeah.
Well, this is a very complicated question. Implants are... do you know... Terry Lovelace?
Yes, and I've been messaging him for a while. He should be on the podcast pretty soon.
You'll enjoy interviewing him. He's a great guy. But Terry had an implant in his knee. I think in one of his knees, really big, complicated implants. That's relatively uncommon because it's fairly easy to access surgically. Most abductees who have implants or who know they have implants, they're at the in the cribriform place where the olfactory nerve goes into the brain, which we already mentioned, or sometimes in the ears. Now, nobody really knows how they put them in the ears. Some abductees say they've got a very extremely thin needle that goes into the ear somehow. You'd think that would be would involve puncturing the eardrum. But a lot of abductees just say they have a ringing sound in the ear for several seconds duration each day. Robert Hastings tells us he's got an ear implant which rings for 10 seconds and then stops each day, or every few days. And he's very specific about this because he's timed it. Some abductees, Betty Andreasson was, or Ted Rice. Ted Rice, who was the subject of one of Carla Turner's books. Ted
I've heard the name, yeah.
Yeah, he was the subject of a book Carla Turner wrote called Masquerade of Angels. Both Ted and Betty Andreasson, who Betty has passed on last year, claim that during an abduction, one of their eyeballs was removed and an implant was placed inside the brain, and then the eye was put back, which sounds immensely improbable, from a medical point of view, but that's what they say, and that's what a lot of abductees claim has happened to them. So the point about it is just a lot of implants in the head, which is the primary source of implants, are extremely difficult to detect and extremely difficult or impossible to remove, and they're a tiny, like a grain of sand or a cantaloupe seed, and they are. I've got a 60-page analysis of an implant in my book from a materials scientist called Steve Colburn, who published the report in 2009, and they're extremely sophisticated devices. They're biologically, they're made up of protein coagulum, hemosiderin, and keratin. Keratin, as you know, is the primary substance in hair and nails. And hemosiderin is to do with tissue aspiration, and protein coagulum works with the body's thrombocytes. So they're biological material, probably harvested from the same abductee that they're placed, that the implant is then placed in. And so they're completely compatible with the body, and the body has no inflammatory response to them at all, which means that abductees have no reaction to them. If they're placed inside the body, the body recognizes it as part of their own biological material. And the core of these devices involves carbon nanotubes, tiny little carbon nanotubes, just a few molecules in thickness, and they emit radio waves in 3 different frequency bands. A lot is known about them, but removing one, identifying and removing one is an extremely sophisticated process. There was a podiatric surgeon in Southern California called Dr. Roger Lear, which many of your audience will know who he was. He died in 2014, and he removed 19 implants, but Roger removed them mainly from the legs and feet because he was a podiatric surgeon, whereas the more complex and interesting ones are usually placed in the brain. The idea that you can go to a GP in the UK, as an example, particularly with the NHS in its current state of crisis, and say that you think you've got an alien implant in your nose, and could they please remove it? I think you are likely to get a certain amount of incredulity, to be greeted by a certain amount of incredulity most of the time. It's not something I'm personally prepared to do because it's so immensely improbable. The whole phenomenon is so immensely improbable, and the medical fraternity, by and large, has little or no acquaintance with it. So you've got to start from square one if you're talking about this with anybody in the medical world. If you get a sympathetic medical doctor who really has studied it and looked into it, if anybody knows of one or any in the UK, could you please get in touch with me and let me know? And I'd like to link up with them. But
Absolutely.
I don't know it.
Yeah, if any listeners do, and they're very good at that, please get in touch and I can pass those details on to Steve if you don't want to do that directly.
Please.
Ryan also asks, is there going to be an audiobook version of the book available?
A member of my family has asked me that because he likes audiobooks. I think probably not. Is Ryan visually impaired or has problems with reading? Or because some people do.
I don't believe so, but I just know it's a more and more popular. It comes up quite often when guests come on and they mention the books, and I don't mention an audiobook. It comes up quite frequently.
Still considering it, but it's a big project to have either me or a professional reader read it out. It's going to be expensive to produce, and I'm not really sure what the size of the audience would be, what the size of the market should be. So it's not something I've done so far, or have any imminent plans to do. But if the book gathers popularity, I probably will eventually do it, yeah.
Well, like I would say, folks, if you're going to pick up a copy, which I know many of you will, and you're very good at picking up the guest books, make sure you leave reviews on the websites as well, so people can see it as being read, picked up, and it's very well reviewed already on Amazon. But audiobooks are gathering more and more popularity with the generations as they are. So yeah, I'm a little bit old school. I like the physical copy. But yeah, I would offer to do it for you, Steve, but there's not much market for a strong Scottish accent in audiobook form. There'd be a lot more complaints and refunds being requested at a lack of understanding what was being said. Last couple of questions, Steve, because you've been really generous with your time, and you've touched on this one slightly, but this is from a very good listener, Gnosis. He asks, are you aware of any family abduction cases that go back, even anecdotally, through 3 or more generations prior to the 1940s?
Well, short answer is no, but my grandmother was abducted all throughout her life. She was born in 1908, and she died in 1968 at age 60 of a heart problem. She was definitely involved in this from infancy, but she cloaked it in the folk tales, fairy, occult sort of explanations that were prevalent at the time. She grew up in West Yorkshire as a farmer's daughter, and she married a carpenter, and she lived in a small village near Bradford in West Yorkshire, and she had no education after age 14 or 15 when she left school, and she never went to college, and she just didn't know anything about astronomy or cosmology or anything like that. So she had a very limited perception of what might be the causative agency of this
thing. And was that something that potentially went back further again with her parents? Was that ever a topic that came up, do you know?
Well, something we haven't mentioned during this interview, but which I do mention in just the first few pages of the book. When I first worked out that these abducting entities can communicate with you, and you can communicate with them, and telepathically, somehow you can talk to them telepathically just as much as they can talk to you. When I worked out that I could actually ask some questions, I asked one of them when I was 10 or 11 years old, probably 10 years old, because I remember the house we lived in at the time, and I remember where I was abducted from. I asked one of them, why are you doing this to me? I was very respectful, and being a kid, you in the 1960s, you kind of fairly respectful of authority, and they seemed to be in charge of you. So I didn't rebel and kick and scream against them so much. I just accepted in some way what they were doing. I said, why am I being chosen for this? Why is this happening to me? And he said, it's because of your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother, and you're the next one in the line. And he just carried on with what he was doing. And I never forgot that, him saying to me. I imagine he said it because he assumed that would be buried and forgotten. But it came back to me as an adult that I remembered him saying that, and I remember the circumstance in which that was told. Now, my great grandmother was born in 1873, and so I think she was probably one of the origin abductees. And if so, in 1890 she would have been 17, which is the start of the reproductive years for a woman. I mean, particularly 100 years ago, when people reach sexual maturity a bit later than they do now for all kinds of reasons. So that's the start of the reproductive life of an adult. And there's something in the book that I write about in the final chapter about a Turkish abductee called Fariye Dursu, who I've known for about 20 years, and she she now lives in Istanbul, and she wrote in one of her autobiographical books. She wrote a story about her great grandfather, a guy called Emin Refik, who was lectured at Istanbul University in the 1890s. She just says that the 1890s, who described being visited at night and paralyzed by two huge reptilian entities who talked to the abductee in his mind and explained to him that he was being chosen for something, and it would be from you to, they said, from you to 3 generations. And they left in the morning. Now, this I quote a little chunk of this book, this text in my book, and Farah's given me permission to do that because it's absolutely pertinent to the thesis that this thing started in the 1890s, and all the origin abductees were chosen in that decade, and they were chosen as young adults. All the origin abductees were young adults, and from their progeny, the program started. So that's about as far back as it goes. And my great grandmother, who I was told in 1966, I was told that it was to do with her and her daughter and me in line. She was exactly fits the time scale of this thesis, yeah.
And I would ask, if you ever heard the idea that if these objects experience, or these entities experience time in a different way to how we do, that for your family, from your great-grandmother, that's been 150 years potentially of experiences, that for them, it's not 150 years, and that could all happen within the space of a few days, because they can literally come in and out the timeline, and your experiences to them happen over minutes or hours.
Don't know if that's true. I'm not sure I can buy into that, but it might be the case. There's more things we don't know than things we do know. I think both the abductors themselves and the grey aliens, who is their slaves, basically, they're genetically created servants to carry out the program, or largely carry out the program. I think they have extremely long lifespans, probably more than a human lifespan. Grey aliens probably have a lifespan at least as long as a long-lived human, maybe a century. And the abductors themselves, the true aliens, we don't know how long they live, but it could be centuries. And they might live through time. They might experience time exactly as we experience it. It's just that they live such a long time. We don't know.
Final question, Steve, from David over on YouTube. He asks, thanks to Dr. Gary Nolan coming out recently, we know that there are people, especially military personnel, who are suffering brain damage or physical alterations after coming into contact with UFOs. Is this something that you have come across either personally or through speaking to other abductees?
Brain damage, and not to that degree, no. I mean, people's abductees are psychologically scarred and they're physically scarred in fairly minor ways. But, some of the scarring is quite noticeable and quite disfiguring. But from what Gary Nolan is discussing, I have no personal acquaintance with that, no.
Yeah.
If you interview Terry Lovelace, you'll find out a lot more about this.
Yeah, I think with Gary's work, especially from what we know at the moment, it seems to be when people come into contact with the outside of these craft in close proximity, as opposed to this doesn't seem to happen when people are taken on board the crafts directly.
Yeah. So something to do with the propulsion system, or the what technologies is deployed to make them move around. There's a number of cases, classic cases in UFO literature. There's a guy in one of the Midwestern states in the United States decades ago who had marks like a grid all over his chest. And he was really badly burned by coming into contact with the unidentified flying object. Do you know that case? I don't remember the guy's name now.
Oh, I've not heard of that one, no.
It's either in Michigan or one of those places, He was out hunting and he encountered a flying saucer, and when it took off, it burnt him it really badly. Terry Lovelace and his buddy, who had their 1977 abduction in a Devil's Den National Park in Arkansas, they both had blistering and burns all over their bodies from head to foot after that experience. Yeah, so that is a thing. It really happens. Yeah.
Well, listen, Steve, I want to ask you one more question as we wrap up. When the listeners buy a copy of Out of Time, what do you hope they take away from it at the end?
What do I hope that they'll take away from it?
Yeah.
You'll get a thesis about the abduction phenomenon, all essential parts of it, which are fairly concrete and incontrovertible. The medical evidence is extremely thorough. Something we didn't go into in the interview was in 2015, an abduction happened in my house, and the following day my wife found a hair this long, what we thought was a blonde grey hair under the dining table, which didn't belong to either of us, because my wife's a red-haired Irish woman, and you can see how long my hair is. And an identical hair was found outside the patio doors on the patio in the garden, and these two hairs were subsequently analysed by a micro analysis laboratory in Illinois called LLC Microtrace or Microtrace LLC, and the analysis of that was done alongside a completely different hair found by an abductee in California, and the results of these forensic analyses of these hairs are also in Out of Time in a long appendix as to exactly what they're made of, and they're pretty astounding, actually. Something quite unexpected. So I won't go into that in what remains of the interview, but you excuse me, you'll find fairly strong scientific, medical, concrete evidence of things like that in Out of Time, which are not always present in books on the abduction subject, and a lot of and you'll find my summary of pulling all these things together, what I think is really going on, which we've touched on in this interview, but it requires quite a lot more than an hour or two to go into.
Well, Steve, I enjoyed reading the book, and the work you've put in is evident alone in the bibliography and the appendix at the end as well, because it really does back up exactly what you've talked about in the body of the text as well. So it's been wonderful speaking with you, Steve. I'll put the links to your work in the description of the podcast, so I would encourage folks to go and pick up a copy of Out of Time, the Intergenerational Abduction Programme Explored. And Steve, again, wonderful speaking to you, and I would just ask, have you got plans to write any further books in the future on the topic?
George Knapp's urging me to do that. You know that George Knapp, who works out of Las Vegas. Yeah. I don't know. I've no plans to do that this year. I'm booked to speak at a conference on the abduction subject being held at Hull University in September, and I may have a couple of other speaking invitations. So once we've got those out of the way and the dust has settled, maybe I'll think about another book, but it's not on the table yet.
Well, maybe I'll get to meet you in person at one of those conferences as well. I might venture to one of them this year.
Yeah, hope so, Andy. Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little around. Meditative gamma state full on meta. I can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. And I called out to my boys. They thought this was noise. They thought it was a dream. They thought it was my toys. They thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what to do because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think I be, I think it's you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jake? But for being serious, open your mind, consider your heart, consider time, consider your space, consider your lies, consider your life, consider your eyes. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer.